And it shall come to pass that as you were a curse among the heathen, O house of Judah and house of Israel, so will I save you. In this final session of the series, Time for the Nations to Reap, we will look at the curses that will come upon the nations that enslaved the descendants of the ancient Israelites. In summary, we found that the oppressors of Yah's people behaved the way they did because their principles and actions are in line with their ancestral beliefs. They were on code, some would say. So let's do a recap using a report from the Equal Justice Initiative, and then we will talk about the reversal of the curse. The curses that came upon our ancestors as a result of our disobedience and idolatry will be placed on the nations involved in our captivity. Continuing, it says, after discovering lands that had been occupied by indigenous people for centuries, European powers sent ships and armed militia to exploit these new lands for wealth and profit starting in the 1400s. In territories we now call the Americas, gold, sugar, tobacco, and extraordinary natural resources were viewed as opportunities to gain power and influence for Portugal, Spain, Great Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Scandinavian nations. Europeans first sought to enslave the indigenous people who occupied these lands to create wealth for foreign powers, resulting in a catastrophic genocide. Disease, famine, and conflict killed millions of native people within a relatively short period of time. Determined to extract wealth from these distant lands, European powers sought labor from Africa, launching a tragic era of kidnapping, abduction, and trafficking that resulted in the enslavement of millions of African people. Between 1501 and 1867, nearly 13 million African people were kidnapped, forced onto European and American ships, and trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean to be enslaved, abused, and forever separated from their homes and families. Now let's be clear about who they were enslaving. When you look at this map, you can clearly see that the countries in West Africa was the target. They went looking for descendants of the ancient Israelites living in those countries. Now let's go on, but I need you to understand that I am doing this recap because you need to keep these things in mind when I talk about the curse being reversed later and the things that will come upon the nations that participated and benefited from our suffering. It says Europe had no contact with sub-Saharan Africa before the Portuguese, seeking wealth and gold, sailed down the western coast of Africa and reached the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, in 1471. Initially focused on obtaining gold, Portugal established trading relationships and built Elmina Fort to protect its interests in the gold trade. It says the convergence of European powers in sub-Saharan Africa set in motion a devastating process that fused sophisticated labor exploitation, international commerce, mass enslavement, and an elaborate race-based ideology to create the transatlantic slave trade. Over the following decades, the Spanish, English, French, Dutch, Danish, and Swedes began to make contact with sub-Saharan Africa as well. Portugal soon converted Elmina into a prison for holding kidnapped Africans, and European traffickers built castles, barracoons, and forts on the African coast to support the forced enslavement of abducted Africans. Now listen carefully. German and Italian merchants and bankers who did not personally traffic kidnapped Africans nonetheless provided essential funding and insurance to develop the transatlantic slave trade and plantation economy. Italian merchants were essential in the effort to extend the sugar plantation system to the Atlantic islands off the west coast of Africa, like Sao Tome, and financial capital from Genoa was instrumental in expanding Portugal's ability to traffic Africans. By the 1600s, listen, every major European power had established trading relationships with sub-Saharan Africa and was participating in the transportation of kidnapped Africans to the Americas in some way. During this time period, several thousand Africans were kidnapped and trafficked to mainland Europe and the Americas, but the volume of human trafficking soon escalated to horrific proportions. The article tells us that in the colonies that became the United States, slavery took on uniquely appalling features. It says from New England to Texas, black people were dehumanized and abused while they were enslaved and denied basic freedoms. Legal and political systems were created to codify racial hierarchy and ensure white supremacy. Slavery became permanent and hereditary, defined by race-based ideologies that insisted on racial subordination of black people for decades after the formal abolition of slavery. Millions of black people born in the U.S. were subjected to abuse, violence, and forced labor despite the young nation's identity as a constitutional democracy founded on the belief that all men are created equal. What a lie that was. It says racialized slavery was ignored, defended, or accommodated by leaders while the new nation gained extraordinary wealth and influence in the global economy based on the forced labor of enslaved black people. The economic legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, including generational wealth and the founding of industries that continue to thrive today, is not well understood. So listen, it says New England, Boston, New York City, and the Mid-Atlantic, Virginia, Richmond, the Carolinas, Charleston, Savannah, the Deep South, and New Orleans were shaped by the trafficking of African people, but few have acknowledged their history of enslavement or its legacy. The horrific conditions of the Middle Passage meant that of more than 12.5 million Africans kidnapped and trafficked through the transatlantic slave trade, only 10.7 million survived the journey. 80% of the people who embarked for the Americas between 1500 and 1820 were kidnapped Africans who far outnumbered European immigrants. Don't miss this. Almost 2 million Africans died during the Middle Passage, nearly 1 million more than all of the Americans who have died in every war fought since 1775 combined. Numbers like this can help to quantify the scope of the harm, but they fail to detail the horrific and torturous experience of those who perished and the trauma that 10.7 million Africans who survived the weeks-long journey carried with them. Now take a look at this photograph. It features more than 200 sculptures by Ghanaian sculptor Kwame Okoto-Bamfo. He is memorializing those who died during the Middle Passage. But do you think they kept an accurate count of the number of people who died on those ships? I think the actual number of those who were thrown overboard like animals are much higher than is being reported. You can best believe that the Most High kept count, though. Let's go on. It says, at the coast, kidnapped Africans were forced into barracoons, slave pens like a hog pen, and dungeons within prison castles to await the ships that would take them across the Atlantic. Kidnapped Africans were forced to board slave trading ships that stayed docked, sometimes for months, until they had loaded enough human cargo to make the passage sufficiently profitable for the enslavers. Records do not establish an exact death toll, but scholars estimate the mortality rate among those confined in barracoons and on-board docked trading ships, listen, equaled that of Europe's 14th century Black Death, which claimed at least 40% of Europe's population. Did you all hear that number? 40% of Europe's population. It says, countless Africans perished before they even began the Middle Passage. So listen to this account from a young child named Otoba Kogowano. It says, he was snatched away from his native country with about 18 or 20 more boys and girls when he was a young child. The kidnappers brandished pistols and cutlasses and threatened to erase the children if they did not come with them. For Otaba and millions like him, the trauma of familial separation would be inflicted repeatedly in the transatlantic slave trade. Otaba's hopes of returning home again were all over, as he was marched to the coast and placed in a prison until a white slave trader's ship arrived 3 days later. It was a most horrible scene, Otaba later recounted. Now, why were they stealing children if they were looking for laborers? Just think about that. It says African captives were forced to undergo invasive and dehumanizing examinations before they boarded enslavers' ships. Women, men, and children were stripped and prodded. And you can use your imagination to figure out what they were doing here. They say they were doing it to find out if they were capable of performing hard labor and having children. But look at the section to read the words. And I think you know what they were doing if it says they were groping. Straight up perverts. And they weren't just doing this to the women and the girls. They also did it to men and boys. This nation didn't just become perverse. It was a trait that was passed down. One white trafficker later testified the process was similar to what he would do to a horse in this country. He says, if I was about to purchase him. It talks about how the men were chained up for weeks during the journey, unable to stretch or stand except for a limited time on deck. it talks about the foul conditions, that it was a breeding ground for disease and vermin. Some suffocated because they didn't have enough air. The mortality rate was as high as 33%. Listen, it says the women and girls didn't fare much better. They were harassed, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, and assaulted repeatedly, then whipped if they tried to resist. A man named Alexander Falconbridge testified that sailors were permitted to indulge their passions. Another account detailed what happened to a little girl of about 8 or 10, and I highlighted that portion. You can read that here. But this was at the hands of the ship's captain for 3 consecutive nights. Again, these atrocities are on record, and the nations will reap what they have sown. I need you to think about that. If we're told that these curses will be placed on those who participated, even though we may feel pity and have sorrow when these things happen, will the prophecy be fulfilled? Yes, these words will not return void. These men didn't have to fear any consequences, because they knew that their behavior would be condoned. It talked about how the women were unable to protect the young infants that were brought with them. They had to watch some of the things that were happening because those sailors were using the babies to manipulate, control, and terrorize the mothers. Some of these stories are just too horrific to even mention in this video. So I will post the link to this article in the description for those who may want to read it. But it talks about the cruelty and the terrorism, and it was commonplace on these ships operated by Europeans. It says sailors inflicted brutal punishments for even minor offenses as a reminder of their control. Just think about that. And what was the role of the Christian church in all of this? It says, rooted in a belief that their duty to spread Christianity justified their actions, religious organizations did not only embrace human trafficking and the enslavement of millions of Africans, they actively participated. It says the Roman Catholic Church was critical to the efforts of global expansion by Portugal, Spain, and France, and the creation of massive commercial enterprises built on the suffering and death of enslaved people. In 1452 and 1455, Pope Nicholas V formally supported Spain and Portugal's mass kidnapping and enslavement of Africans because it would help to Christianize enslaved people. You would think that Africans would be saints by now when you consider the heavy evangelization by Christians. They were loving people to death. It says in 1548, Pope Paul III used his apostolic authority to declare the slave trade legal in the eyes of the church, which empowered the religious monarchies in European nations to continue to engage in transatlantic trafficking. The popes and their friends accepted gifts of enslaved black people shipped from Africa to Rome. Through transatlantic trafficking, the church systematically extended its influence. European enslavers baptized millions of enslaved people whose labor they use to amass vast wealth. Let's go on. It says the Jesuits, a religious order of the Catholic Church, justified slavery as a path to evangelization. But this did not insulate the people they enslaved from the exploitation, brutality, and dehumanization that was central to the system of chattel slavery. Like other enslavers, the Jesuits forced enslaved people to work on Jesuit sugar plantations, cattle ranches, tobacco farms, and vineyards, urban collegios, and as domestic servants. During the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, several groups of European Christians formally broke away from the Roman Catholic Church. These new Protestant churches also supported transatlantic trafficking and believed the slave trade was wholly compatible with Christianity. So for those who thought the Protestants were different, think again. The KKK heavily recruited white men who were Protestants. Listen to this from Howard Center for Investigative Journalism. It says some Protestant churches welcomed revival of the Ku Klux Klan. I need you to think about this. Members of the KKK identify as Christian. They walked down the aisle and got saved. They have been baptized, and they are full-fledged members of Christian churches. These people bombed black churches, but hey, they believe in God. The question we should be asking is, which God are they talking about? And for the Muslims among us who believe that Islam was so much better than Christianity, you need to think again. Look at this list from World Atlas. It lists the African countries with Islam as the religion of the majority. So the majority of people in these countries are Muslim. You can look at the list, but I will highlight some of them. Somalia, Sudan, Libya, Guinea, Niger, Burkina Faso, Sierra Leone, Chad. Now I ask, did Muslim countries try to intervene when European nations trafficked millions of people from West Africa? No, because they did the same thing. Did they strongly object to the treatment of our people during colonization? Why didn't they come to the defense of those African Muslim nations being exploited by Europeans even today? Read about the sub-Saharan slave trade and see how the Muslims treated the people in West Africa. So is Islam any better than Christianity? No. As we discussed in the series, Christianity and Islam were used to enslave our people, not help us. There was money to be made in the trafficking of our people. The article says New Englanders profited from the kidnapping and trafficking of African people around the world. And I should add, the Christian and Muslim nations profited from our enslavement. It says the business of buying and selling black people was not limited to large firms, but was pervasive among New England business owners who purchased shares in the transatlantic voyages. Slavery decimated our families and destroyed relationships. The article says family separation was common in New England despite Puritan family values. We need to laugh at that. Family values in America, really. A Massachusetts newspaper in 1782 advertised a 19-year-old enslaved black woman and her 6-month-old baby for sale, either together or apart. Enslaved people in New England were often made to live in the homes of their enslavers and work alongside their enslavers in local industries where they were under constant surveillance. By the start of the Revolutionary War, 1 in 4 estates in Connecticut enslaved at least one black person, 1 in 4. Despite widespread narratives advanced by New Englanders who claimed their type of slavery was based on the belief that slaves were considered part of the enslaver's family, racial hierarchy and violence were dominating features of enslavement in New England. A Connecticut newspaper in 1774 advertised the sale of a 14-year-old Negro boy who has one of his little toes cut off and a dent in his forehead. How do you think that happened? In New Hampshire, an advertisement read, "Ran away, a Negro servant named Neptune, of about 25 years of age. His under jaw has been broken, so that he can't open his jaws, and one of his great toes has been cut off." This says free black people, supposedly free, in New England were subjected to curfews, discrimination, black codes, bans on interracial marriage, and frequent violence from white citizens. In 1824, white community members in Providence, Rhode Island destroyed nearly every home and business in a black neighborhood after a group of black residents failed to step off the sidewalk to let a group of white people pass. The narrative of racial difference that justified the trafficking of black people that propagated the growth of New England industries persisted long after New Englanders joined their fellow colonists to declare that all men are created equal. Indeed, white New Englanders remained committed to white supremacy long after the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade and the end of slavery in the U.S. As they are today, not much has changed. Laws were enacted to target our people. Listen to this. It says, white New Yorkers justified exploiting the labor of enslaved people to build their city with false narratives of racial difference rooted in white supremacy and black inferiority. The ideology of inferiority included the myth that black people were inherently dangerous, a false idea that was employed to justify swift, brutal, and violent responses to any threat to the social order. Don't we see that happening today? In 1712, when a group of enslaved people engaged in an uprising and asserted their right to freedom, the government responded by executing 21 enslaved people, the majority of whom were hanged. And that wasn't all. They used fire and other horrific means to inflict pain. And it wasn't just the white Southerners, you all. Northerners were just as guilty. Listen to this. The New York Assembly discouraged emancipation by requiring an enslaver to pay a 200-pound tax or fee, which is over $50,000 today, for each emancipated person. Did you hear that? These new laws both reflected and encouraged the race-based fears of white New Yorkers. In March and April of 1741, a series of fires across New York were blamed on the city's enslaved population and treated as coordinated acts of arson. Hysteria ensued, and city officials initiated a mass arrest of the enslaved population of the city, forcing so many people into city jails that the magistrates feared a plague. A series of sensational trials began only weeks after the fires, and dozens of enslaved people were convicted, largely on the testimony of a paid 16-year-old white informant. City officials hanged 18 enslaved people, burned 13 people, and banished more than 70 to bondage in the West Indies. The numbers of kidnapped Africans who disembarked in New York increased from 916 people between 1700 and 1725 to 1,211 between 1726 and 1750. From 1751 to 1775, at least 3,583 kidnapped African people were trafficked through New York City, nearly 3 times the number during the previous 25 years. By 1771, 33% of the residents of modern-day Brooklyn were enslaved African people. And we know that the economy was based on slavery. It says New York State did not officially abolish slavery until 1827. Even after abolition, New York City remained invested in enslavement and continued to profit from human bondage. By some estimates, the city received 40% of U.S. cotton revenue through its financial firms, shipping businesses, and insurance companies. Insurance companies based in New York, including New York Life Insurance Company and Aetna Inc., which are the country's largest life and health insurance companies today, sold policies that reimbursed enslavers for financial losses when the people they enslaved died. That's not all. Banks based in New York, such as Citizens Bank and Canal Bank, which later became part of J.P. Morgan Chase, accepted enslaved people as collateral on loans and collected 1,250 black people when plantation owners defaulted. The National City Bank of New York, the predecessor bank of Citibank, which today has offices at 111 Wall Street, was founded by a white man named Moses Taylor, a banker and sugar trader who helped finance the transatlantic slave trade after it was outlawed in 1808. Mr. Taylor was one of the wealthiest men in the 19th century, with an estate reportedly worth $70 million. That's about $1.6 billion today. And it gets worse. New York City courts regularly returned former enslaved people to white enslavers who made claims under the Fugitive Slave Act. Many of these lawsuits were presided over by Judge Richard Riker, a former enslaver, whose city constable Tobias Boudinot once boasted could arrest and send any black to the South. Judge Riker often classified black people as fugitive slaves without due process of law. He is the namesake of Rikers Island, where thousands of black New Yorkers are currently confined in one of the country's most inhumane and overcrowded jail systems. And that was just a summary of the things our people endured. But based on scripture, the curse will be placed on those who did those things. Let me read Deuteronomy 31-7 again. Now it shall come to pass when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse. We experienced both. When all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before you, and you call them to mind, where will you call these things to mind? Among all the nations where the Most High drives you. And you return to the Most High and obey his voice according to all that I command you today. This is Moses speaking. You and your children with all your heart and with all your soul, that the Most High will bring you back from captivity and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations where the Most High has scattered you. If any of you are driven out to the farthest parts under heaven, from there the Most High will gather you, and from there he will bring you. Then the Most High will bring you to the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. He will prosper you and multiply you more than your fathers. And the Most High will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants, to love the Most High with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. Now listen. Also, the Most High will put all these curses on your enemies and on those who hate you, who persecuted you. Joel 3 tells us to make a proclamation to the nations that they need to prepare for war. And one of the reasons listed is because of the way they treated his people. Now, if you read the book of Deuteronomy, you will see that the curse is to be reversed. I have some of the curses listed here with scriptural reference. I encourage you to read the rest on your own. But you will see these things be lifted from us and placed on our enemies. They will be cursed in the city and in the field. They will have scarcity. Cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Infertility. Cursed shall be the offspring of your body and the produce of your ground. There will be instability. He will send upon you confusion and rebuke you in all the things you plan to do. You will see sickness. You will be smitten with consumption and with fever and with inflammation. You'll have drought. The heaven which is over your head shall be bronze, and the earth which is under you shall be iron. You will be defeated before your enemies. You will go out one way against them, but you will flee 7 ways before them. Your carcass will be food for the birds and the beasts. You will have confusion and mental illness. You will be smitten with madness and with blindness and with bewilderment of heart. Your wives will be violated. You will betroth a wife, but another man will violate her. You will have your goods stolen, your property and your inheritance. You will build a house, but you will not live in it. Your children will be abducted and violated. Your sons and your daughters will be given to another people. You will have severe oppression. You will be oppressed and crushed continually. You will become a reproach and made to be ashamed. You will become a horror and a proverb and a taunt among the other nations of the earth. You will have plagues of locusts and insects. He will bring extraordinary plagues on you and your descendants, even severe and lasting plagues, and you will experience slavery and exile. You will have sons and daughters, but they will not be yours, because they will go into captivity. Now, for the Gentiles who now know that we are the people, that's great. Now go and tell your people. It's all well and good that you want us to know that you know. But if you really believe what you're saying and you can see what's coming, you need to go and warn your people. When you look at the nations involved and trace their descendants, you're going to see the same people. It was a coalition against us. And who was leading the effort? Esau. He is the hidden hand. The Edomites are the people behind the scenes, calling the shots. Listen to this from Psalm 83, 1-4. Do not keep silent, O Yah. Do not hold your peace, and do not be still, O Yah. For behold, your enemies make a tumult. Notice that it does not say the enemies of Israel here. The Most High's enemies make a tumult. They hate him. And those who hate you have lifted up their head. They have taken crafty counsel against your people and consulted together against your sheltered ones. So because they hate him, they hated his people. They have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation. Not to destroy completely, but to cut them off so that they would no longer be a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more. For they have consulted together with one consent. They have formed a confederacy against you. They are against the Most High. That's who they think they're fighting against. So one way to do that was to come against his people, to scatter, to uproot, to cut them off from their customs and their heritage, to get them to serve pagan deities, the gods of wood and stone. But their actions are against Yah. Now, as you read to the end of that passage, you're going to see that a prayer was offered up concerning the nations that came against the Most High and his people. And you'll notice that this prayer isn't a turning the other cheek kind of prayer. It's a prayer for them to be punished. Christianity taught the pie in the sky doctrine that will allow people to do whatever they want without consequence. Listen to this from verses 13 through 18. O my Yah, make them like the whirling dust, like the chaff before the wind. As the fire burns the woods and as the flame sets the mountains on fire, so pursue them with your tempest and frighten them with your storm. Fill their faces with shame, that they may seek your name, O Yah. So at the end of the day, they will reverence the name of the Almighty and bow. It says, let them be confounded and dismayed forever. Yes, let them be put to shame and perish, that they may know you whose name alone is Yah, that you are the Most High over all the earth. Now, for those who feel, well, it's just unfair. It's unfair for the Gentiles to be punished because you say, well, Israel sinned and the Gentile nations were just used to help bring about their judgment. Why should they be punished for that? There's something you need to understand. The Gentiles were allowed to do it because it was already in their heart. If you remember the words of Messiah when he said, a man who looks at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. He's telling you that sin begins in the heart. When you see yourself doing and committing the wicked deed, that yoke has already ensnared you. The nations that did all of those horrible things to our people already had those evil intentions. That wickedness came from within. Because of our sin and our disobedience, the Most High allowed us to be handed over to those nations, and they did what was already inside of them. They didn't wake up one day and say, oh, I think I'll go out and just have my way with these men, women, and children who are at my mercy. No, they were already that way. Listen to this from Zechariah 1:14. And I'm going to read this from the Septuagint. And the angel that spoke with me said to me, cry out and say, thus says the Most High, the Almighty, I have been jealous for Jerusalem and Zion with great jealousy, and I am very angry with the heathen that combined to attack her. They came together, they plotted and schemed, and came together to attack her. Listen, for as much as I indeed was a little angry, he was a little angry with us, but they, the heathen, combined to attack her for evil. Do you see? They already had the wicked intentions toward our people. Therefore, thus says the Most High, I will return to Jerusalem with compassion, and my house shall be rebuilt in her, says the Most High, the Almighty, and a measuring line shall yet be stretched out over Jerusalem. The other thing you need to remember is this from Deuteronomy 32:9. For the Most High's portion is his people. We belong to him. We have been set aside unto him, his tenth, his tithe. So what you do to us, you do to him. So yes, other nations have gone into captivity, and the end result was not the same because they didn't belong to him. It says Jacob is the place of his inheritance. And as a result, he punished us, but it wasn't to utterly destroy us. He chastened us because he loved us. So we will end with this passage of scripture from Zechariah 8:13. And it shall come to pass that just as you were a curse among the nations, O house of Judah and house of Israel, so I will save you, and you shall be a blessing. Do not fear. Let your hands be strong. He is our Savior. He saves us from the hand of our enemy. And that brings us to the end of this series, Time for the Nations to Reap. I pray that it has been a blessing to you. I encourage you to hit the like and please share it with others. As a reminder, we normally upload the messages on Sundays at 8:30 a.m. If you've not subscribed, you're welcome to do so. Until next time, be blessed, family.